A cowboy finds a diary left behind on a train. He opens it. The first line reads, "If someone is reading these words, it means I have failed to keep the only secret I have left." The pages are stained with blood. The woman who wrote it is running for her life from a man who wants to steal everything she owns. And this cowboy, a stranger who has never seen her face, decides to track her down across 5 towns and through a storm to return the one thing she cannot afford to lose. But what he does not expect is falling in love with her voice before he ever hears it spoken aloud. This is a story about courage, about freedom, and about the moment one man decided that a woman's words were worth fighting for. Welcome to Wild West Stories channel, where the dust never settles and love rides harder than any outlaw. This is your home for tales of cowboys and frontier hearts, where grit meets grace and the open range holds secrets worth finding. If you love stories of courage under big skies and love forged in wildfire, you are exactly where you belong. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not to fight or to run, but to stand still and let someone see the real you. And sometimes the right person will cross 5 towns and walk through a storm just to return what the world tried to take from you. If this story moved you, if it made your heart beat a little faster or your eyes sting just a little, do me a favor. Hit that like button so more people can find it. Drop a comment and tell me which moment hit you the hardest. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their words matter. And if you have not already, subscribe to Wild West Stories and ring that bell so you never miss a tale worth telling. New stories ride in every week. I will see you on the next trail. The diary slid out from under the seat just as Emmett Crawford stood to disembark, and with it came the faint smell of gunpowder clinging to the leather cover. He had not been looking for anything. He had been looking out the window at the fading Missouri afternoon, watching the hills roll past like the backs of sleeping animals, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. The train lurched on a rough bit of track, and something small and brown tumbled from beneath the seat in front of him and landed against his boot. Emmett bent down. His fingers closed around a leather-bound book no bigger than his hand. The cover was worn smooth from years of handling, the color of old saddle leather left too long in the sun. A faded blue ribbon marked a place within the pages. And there, carved into the lower right corner of the front cover, was a single letter. The letter M, cut into the hide with care, with love, by someone who meant it to last. He glanced around the nearly empty passenger car. An elderly woman slept in the far corner with her head tilted against the glass. A drummer in a wrinkled suit shuffled toward the exit, hauling 2 heavy sample cases. Neither seemed the type to carry such a thing. The book was small and feminine, the kind of journal a woman might keep close to her heart. Emmett turned it over. That was when he noticed the blood. A dark smear along the spine, dried and old, barely visible against the brown leather. Not much, but enough to make his stomach tighten. He should have left it with the conductor. He should have handed it over to the station master and walked away. But something about that carved letter held him. Something about the blood. Something about the way the ribbon had been tied with such care, marking a page that mattered to someone. The conductor called out the final warning for Silver Reef, Missouri. Emmett tucked the diary into the inside pocket of his coat, grabbed his saddlebag and rifle case, and stepped down onto the platform where the late afternoon sun of June 1882 painted everything in shades of gold. Silver Reef was a mining town that had seen better days but still held on to enough silver prospects to keep folks hopeful. Emmett had come looking for ranch work. He was 31 years old, a former Army scout turned drifting cowboy, and he carried more scars than savings. The longest scar ran down his left forearm from wrist to elbow. He never talked about it. He never rolled his sleeves up in company. He found lodging at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson and settled into a small room with a narrow bed and a washstand. After scrubbing the travel dust from his face and hands, he sat on the edge of the mattress and pulled out the diary. He knew he should not read it. A person's private thoughts were sacred ground. But how else would he find out who it belonged to? Surely there would be a name, an address, some clue. He opened to the first page. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, as though the words had poured out faster than the pen could keep up, and the first line hit him like a fist. If someone is reading these words, it means I have failed to keep the only secret I have left. Emmett read 3 entries that night. He learned the writer was named Margaret, though she called herself Maggie. Her full name was Margaret Calloway. She was running from an arranged marriage to a man named Harlan Winters, a freight company owner from Springfield who did not just want a wife. He wanted the land her dead mother had left her. Land that was legally in Maggie's name alone. The marriage was the cleanest way to take it. Her father, Frederick Calloway, who owned a feed store in Carthage, had sided with Winters, called it practical, called it a daughter's duty. Maggie called it something else. On the folded marriage contract tucked inside the front cover, where her signature should have been, someone had scratched a hard red line through the space and written in furious slanting script, "I am not livestock to be sold." Emmett sat with that line for a long time. Then he turned to the last entry marked by the ribbon and saw that 2 pages had been torn out. The remaining edges were stained dark, not ink. Blood. Whatever happened the night Maggie fled Carthage, she had ripped it from the record. And Emmett Crawford, who had spent 3 years running from his own father and his own home, and a letter he still had not opened, felt something shift inside his chest, something that felt like recognition. He closed the diary. He did not sleep well that night. Maggie Calloway had known she was being followed since 3 towns back. She just did not know by whom. She sat on a rented horse in the dark outside Verona, Missouri, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the reins. The night air smelled of cut grass and coming rain. Behind her, the lights of the small hotel where she had almost taken a room for the night. Ahead of her, nothing but black road and blacker sky. She had not planned to leave Verona in the dark. She had planned to sleep, to eat something warm, to stop running for one single night. But the desk clerk had asked a question that changed everything. "You would not happen to be from Carthage, would you? A gentleman was in here earlier today asking about a young, dark-haired woman from that direction." Maggie had smiled politely and said no, she was from Jefferson City. Then she had turned around, walked to the livery, rented a horse, and ridden out the back road before the sun finished setting. Her diary was gone. She had lost it 2 days ago on the train. Somewhere between one stop and the next, her carpet bag had shifted during boarding, when a woman carrying a crying baby bumped hard into her. The diary must have slipped out. She did not realize it was missing until the train had already pulled away from Silver Reef, carrying her mother's voice with it. That diary was not just a record of her thoughts. It was the last thread connecting her to Eleanor Calloway, who had kept the first third of its pages filled with her own words before illness took her 5 years ago. Maggie had inherited it at 17 and written in it every single day since. Losing it felt like losing her mother a second time. But she could not go back. She could not go back for anything. Maggie was not soft. She carried a small Derringer pistol in her carpet bag. It had been her mother's. Eleanor had taught Maggie to shoot tin cans behind the barn when Frederick was at the store, laughing at her daughter's aim and saying every woman ought to know how to make noise when she needed to. Maggie had never fired at a person. She hoped she would never have to. She also had a temper she worked hard to keep under control, and a habit of talking to herself when she was scared. She would narrate her own situation aloud, as if she were a character in a story, because that somehow made things feel manageable. "All right, Maggie," she whispered to the horse. "You are a woman alone on a dark road in Missouri with about $12 to your name and people looking for you. You have been in worse situations." She paused. "No, you have not. This is the worst one." The horse flicked an ear back at the sound of her voice, but kept walking. She remembered the night she left Carthage, the night she did not write about, the pages she tore out and burned. Frederick had locked the parlor door from outside. his clumsy, desperate attempt to keep her in the house until morning when Winters could come and talk sense into her. Maggie had sat on the parlor floor with her knees drawn up, listening through the door as Winters spoke to her father in a voice that was polite on top and iron underneath. "If she will not sign willingly, there are other avenues, Frederick. The law favors men with resources, you know this." And her father's silence. That was what broke her. Not Winters' words, but her father's silence. The silence of a man who knew it was wrong but would not say so. Maggie had taken her mother's derringer from the writing desk, aimed at the lock, and pulled the trigger. The blast echoed through the house like a thunderclap. The lock shattered. She walked out through the smoke with the diary pressed against her ribs under her coat, gunpowder residue on everything she carried. She had not looked back. Now, riding through the Missouri darkness toward Aurora, her horse suddenly stopped, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring at something ahead. Maggie peered into the black. A campfire glowed maybe 200 yards off the road, and voices carried in the still night air, at least 2 men. One of them said, clearly enough for Maggie to hear every word, "Winters said she would take this road." Maggie's blood turned to ice. She pulled the derringer from her bag, turned the horse off the road into the tall grass, and rode into the darkness without looking back. Aunt Clara did not open the door. She stood behind it with the chain on and a shotgun barrel poking through the gap, aimed square at Emmett's chest. "Pardon me, ma'am," Emmett said carefully, keeping his hands visible and well away from his sides. "I am not here to cause trouble. My name is Emmett Crawford, and I am looking for your niece, Margaret Calloway. I have something that belongs to her." Clara Penfield was a widow in her middle 50s who lived alone in a tidy cottage on Maple Street in Silver Reef. She had gray hair pinned back tight, a face that showed every year she had earned, and the steady hands of a woman who had held that shotgun before and would not hesitate to use it. "Everybody is looking for Margaret," she said through the gap. "2 men came to this door 3 days ago asking the same questions. I have been sleeping with this gun ever since. Give me one reason I should believe you are any different from them." Emmett understood her caution. He reached slowly into his coat and pulled out the diary, holding it where she could see the cover through the gap. That carved M caught the morning light. "Do you recognize this?" he said. Clara's eyes locked onto the book. Her grip on the shotgun shifted. "Where did you get that?" she said, and her voice changed. Less steel, more fear. "Found it on the train from Kansas City. It slipped out from under a seat after your niece got off. I read enough to figure out who it belonged to, and I have been trying to return it since." Clara stared at the carved M for a long moment. Then she said, "Eleanor carved that letter herself, 12 years ago. Used a bone-handled knife that belonged to her grandmother. Nobody outside this family would know that." The chain came off. The door opened. The shotgun stayed in Clara's hands but pointed at the floor. Inside the cottage, surrounded by roses and glass jars and the smell of fresh-baked bread, Clara told Emmett what she knew. Maggie had stayed with her for nearly 2 weeks, helped around the house, visited the local school, started to breathe again for the first time since leaving Carthage. Then Frederick's letter arrived. He was coming to Silver Reef with Winters, coming to collect his daughter like an overdue debt. Maggie had packed her bags and left within a day. Clara had tried to protect her niece in her own way. When the 2 men came asking 3 days later, she told them Maggie had gone south toward the Arkansas border. A lie. Maggie had actually gone northeast toward Springfield with stops along the way. Clara did not know if the men believed her. One of them was smooth, Clara said, dressed well. Black vest, polished boots. Said he was just trying to help the family find their girl. The other one barely spoke, just watched. They made my skin crawl, and that is the honest truth. She also told Emmett that she had written to Thomas, Maggie's younger brother in Carthage. Thomas was the only family member Clara trusted. "He is a good boy," she said. "He loves his sister. He just does not have the power to stand up to Frederick on his own." Emmett asked about Springfield and the route. Clara gave him what she could. The train line runs northeast through Verona, Aurora, Marionville, and Billings before reaching Springfield. Maggie mentioned wanting to find teaching work. She is smart as a whip, and she has the education for it. She would head for schools. Before Emmett left, Clara gripped his arm. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You do not even know her." Emmett looked at the diary in his hands. "Because she is alone out there, and this matters to her. Because somebody should give a damn." Clara's eyes grew wet. "Then you had best hurry, Mr. Crawford. You are not the only one looking." That afternoon, before leaving Silver Reef, Emmett stopped at the saloon for a drink and a meal. The ride to Verona would take most of the next day on horseback, and he needed fuel. The saloon was half empty in the midday heat, just a few miners nursing beers and a card game in the corner. A man sat alone at the far end of the bar. He was well dressed in a black vest and a clean white shirt, which was unusual for a mining town saloon. His boots were polished, his hands were clean. He looked like money passing through. He caught Emmett's eye and nodded in that easy way strangers acknowledge each other in small-town bars. Emmett nodded back and ordered whiskey and a plate of whatever was hot. The man slid down a few stools close enough for conversation. "Name is Sullivan," he said. "Land surveyor out of Springfield. Just passing through on business. Hot day for traveling." "Emmett Crawford," Emmett said. "And yes, it is. They talk the way men talk in saloons. Weather, the condition of the roads, the price of silver." Sullivan was pleasant, easy to talk to, the kind of man who asked questions that made you feel interesting. After the second whiskey, which Sullivan had bought, the man said, "You look like a fellow on a mission, Mr. Crawford. Business or pleasure bringing you through Silver Reef." Emmett should have been more careful. He knew that later, when it was too late. But he was tired and a little drunk and grateful for company after days of solitary travel. He said, "Neither exactly. Trying to return something to someone. A young woman lost an item on the train, and I am trying to track her down to give it back." Sullivan raised his eyebrows. "That is mighty decent of you. A young woman, you say. She passed through here recently." Emmett did not give Maggie's name. He did not show the diary. But he said enough. "Young woman traveling alone, heading northeast." He watched Sullivan nod sympathetically, finish his drink, and tip his hat on the way out. Emmett thought nothing of it. The next morning he bought a horse from the livery, a sturdy bay gelding that cost him nearly all of his savings. The train schedule was predictable, and anyone tracking Maggie would know the timetable. Horseback gave him flexibility, the ability to cut cross-country, to move when and where he chose. He rode out of Silver Reef before dawn, following the northeast road through the Missouri hills. The land opened up around him in shades of green and brown, limestone ridges breaking through the earth like bones, oak forests thick enough to block the sun. Creeks cut silver lines through the valleys, and the air smelled of wild mint and warm dirt. This was real country, the kind of country that tested a man and did not apologize for it. That night he camped by a creek and built a small fire. He pulled out the diary and read by firelight. He had reached an entry from several months back, before winters became an immediate threat. Maggie wrote about the kind of man she dreamed of. Not wealthy or powerful, just someone who listens without trying to fix me. Someone who looks at me and sees me. Not whose daughter I am, not whose future wife, just me. Emmett read those words twice. He had never thought of himself as the kind of man any woman might dream about. He was weathered and scarred and carried too much silence inside him. But he knew how to listen. He had always known. Nobody had ever seemed to care about that before. He also read the entry about Thomas, Maggie's 17-year-old brother, who had hidden Maggie in the root cellar the first time Winters came to call. Thomas could not stand against his father openly. He was too young, too dependent, too afraid. But he had done what he could, hidden his sister, lied for her, slipped her money from the feed store register. Maggie had written, "Thomas is the only man in my life who has never asked me to be smaller than I am." Emmett felt something twist in his chest. Recognition. He thought about his own father back in Tennessee, about the letter sitting in his saddlebag, 3 months unopened. He pulled it out and held it near the fire, close enough to read the handwriting on the envelope. His father's hand, shaky but determined. He could not open it, not yet. He put it back and stared at the flames until they burned low. In the morning, he was saddling the bay when the station master Jim came running out from the depot, waving his arms. "Mr. Crawford, hold up a minute." Jim was out of breath, his weathered face red with exertion. "Those two fellows," he panted, "the ones who were asking about a woman from Carthage. They bought tickets to Verona this morning at first light, and the one in the black vest, the polished one. He was asking about you too. Wanted to know which direction you rode out last night." Emmett's blood went cold. The man from the saloon, Sullivan, the black vest, the easy questions, and the bought whiskey, not a land surveyor at all. Emmett had sat at a bar and handed a tracker a trail of breadcrumbs. He swore under his breath, mounted the bay, and kicked hard for Verona. He was no longer just trying to find Maggie. He was in a race against the man in the black vest, and he was already behind. The first bullet Maggie Calloway ever fired at anything besides a tin can went straight into the sky, but the crack of it was enough to make two shadows stumble backward into the dark. She did not wait to see if they would come back. She jammed the derringer into her coat pocket, kicked the horse into a flat gallop, and rode blind through the Missouri night with her heart hammering so loud she could hear it over the hoofbeats. The men at the campfire were not Winter's people. She understood that even in the chaos. They were road agents, common thieves who saw a woman riding alone after dark and saw opportunity. The West did not need a villain to be dangerous. It was dangerous all on its own. But understanding did not make her less terrified. The horse stumbled on a root or a rock. Maggie never knew which. One moment she was riding hard, and the next the world tilted sideways and she was airborne, the dark ground rushing up to meet her. She landed on her left shoulder against something hard and sharp, and the pain bloomed through her like fire. Her carpetbag split open on impact, spilling its contents across the grass. She lay there for a few seconds, stunned, the horse circling nervously a few yards away. Then she pushed herself up, gasping at the pain in her shoulder, and crawled on her hands and knees through the grass, gathering what she could find by feel. Her fingers closed on a few crumpled bills, a comb, her mother's hairpin. Most of her money was gone. Scattered in darkness, she could not search. She pulled herself back onto the horse, her left arm hanging nearly useless, and rode on. By the time Aurora appeared in the gray light of early morning, Maggie was dizzy with pain and exhaustion. Blood had soaked through her dress at the shoulder where a rock had cut her deep. She had maybe $12 left, no diary, no plan beyond putting one foot in front of the other. Aurora was a farming town of maybe 700 souls, bigger than Verona, but still the kind of place where strangers got noticed. Maggie rode down the main street looking for the schoolhouse because schools meant teachers, and teachers meant women who might understand her situation. She found it on the edge of town. A one-room building painted red with white trim and a bell tower on the roof. It was early before school hours, but smoke rose from the chimney of a small cottage beside it. Maggie dismounted carefully, holding her injured arm against her ribs, and knocked on the cottage door. The woman who answered was in her middle 40s, lean and sharp-eyed with gray threading through brown hair that she wore pinned up in a practical bun. She took one look at Maggie, at the blood on her dress and the pallor of her face, and said, "Come inside right now." Her name was Ruth Dawson. She had taught school in Aurora for 15 years. Her husband had been killed 3 years ago in a land dispute with a mining outfit, shot dead on his own property for refusing to sell. Ruth had buried him, dried her eyes, and gone back to teaching the next Monday because the children still needed her, and grief was a luxury she could not afford. She sat Maggie down in the kitchen, cut away the torn dress fabric, cleaned the shoulder wound with carbolic acid that burned like hell itself, and bandaged it with strips of clean cotton. She did all of this without asking a single question about how it had happened or where Maggie had come from. When she was done, she set a plate of eggs and biscuits in front of Maggie and poured coffee. Then she sat across the table and said, "Eat first. Talk when you are ready, or do not talk at all. Either way, you are safe here." Maggie ate. And then, to her own surprise, she talked. Not everything, not the real details. She used the name Norton and said she was looking for teaching work. But Ruth had been running her own quiet network for years. helping women in trouble find lodging and safe passage and employment. She recognized the signs, the false name, the over-the-shoulder glances, the flinch when a door closed too hard. Ruth did not press. She simply helped. Over the next day, while Maggie rested and her shoulder began to heal, Ruth taught her things that no school had ever covered. How to register at hotels without raising suspicion. Use a different false name in each town and never give your real origin. How to carry money in multiple places on your body. Some in your boot, some sewn into a hem, some in your hatband. Losing your bag should never mean losing everything. How to tell if someone had been asking about you. Check with the postmaster first. They know everything. Ruth also watched Maggie with the neighbor children who came to play in her yard after school. 3 boys and 2 girls, muddy-kneed and loud, fighting over a ball and demanding arbitration from whoever happened to be sitting on Ruth's porch. Maggie settled their dispute without raising her voice, asked each child a question about what had happened instead of simply declaring a winner, and had them laughing and playing together again within 5 minutes. Ruth leaned against the porch railing and studied her. "You are a teacher," she said simply. "It is in the way you talk to them, patient but not soft. You ask questions instead of handing out answers. That is a gift, and it is rare." Maggie looked up, startled. "I have never actually taught in a school. Does not matter. You have the thing that matters. The rest is just practice." Before bed that night, Ruth pressed a sealed letter into Maggie's hand. "This is an introduction to a friend of mine in Marionville, Ida Henderson. She runs a boarding house, and she knows everybody in 3 counties. If there is teaching work to be had, Ida will know where." Maggie tried to thank her, but Ruth waved it off. "I am not doing you a favor. I am investing in a good teacher. The world needs more of those." Alone in Ruth's spare room that night, Maggie allowed herself to feel what she had been shoving down for weeks. She missed home. Not Winters, not the engagement or the locked parlor door or her father's cold silences, but the smell of bread baking in the kitchen at dawn. Thomas's laugh when he found an interesting rock, the creak of the porch swing on summer evenings, even Frederick's gruff voice calling her to supper. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled a blank sheet of paper from Ruth's writing desk. She picked up the pen. She started writing. "Dear Father." She stopped, stared at the words. Her hand shook. She could go back, end all of this, sleep in her own bed, see Thomas every day. She would not have to run anymore. Would not have to worry about money or strangers or sleeping with one eye open. All she had to do was marry a man she did not love and give up the land her mother had left her and surrender every dream she had ever held and become exactly what everyone expected her to become. Maggie looked at the 2 words on the page. "Dear Father." Then she tore the paper in half, and in half again, and fed the pieces to the stove. The flames took them quickly. She watched until there was nothing left but ash. That act of tearing cost her something. She could feel it in her chest, a small grief added to the larger one she already carried. But courage did not mean never wavering. Courage meant wavering and choosing anyway. In the morning, Ruth came in from the porch with a tight expression. "There are 2 men at the general store across the street," she said quietly. "Been there since it opened, asking about a Miss Norton. One of them is wearing a black vest." Maggie went to the window and peered through the curtain. Her stomach dropped. The man in the black vest stood in front of the general store, talking to the shopkeeper, gesturing casually. She knew him. Silas Pike, Harlan Winters' foreman. The last time she had seen him, he was standing in her father's parlor, watching her with flat, patient eyes, while Winters made his threats. "They found me," Maggie whispered. Ruth was already moving. "Out the back," she said. "I saddled a horse 10 minutes ago. Follow the creek south for half a mile, then cut east to the rail station in Cotter. There is a morning train to Marionville. Go to Ida Henderson's place. Show her my letter." Maggie grabbed her bag with her good arm. Ruth caught her wrist and held it. "Listen to me," Ruth said. "You are stronger than you think. Remember that." And then Maggie was running again. The horse tied in front of the schoolteacher's cottage had blood on the saddle, and it was the same roan mare the stable master in Verona described renting to a young woman traveling alone. Emmett had been riding hard for 2 days, cutting cross-country through the Missouri hill country. Real western landscape, all limestone ridges and oak forests, creek crossings where the water ran cold and fast over white gravel. He had pushed the bay gelding as hard as he dared, and arrived in Aurora a full day behind Maggie, but at least on the right trail. The roan mare was the first solid confirmation he had found since Silver Reef. Maggie had been here. She had returned the horse before switching to the train to outrun Pike. Smart. The train was faster, but it also meant she was running scared enough to abandon the flexibility of horseback for speed. Emmett tied the bay next to the roan and knocked on the cottage door. The woman who answered was not what he expected. She was lean and hard-eyed, with the look of someone who had survived things she did not talk about. She crossed her arms and planted herself in the doorway like a fence post that was not going anywhere. "I am looking for a young woman who passed through here recently," Emmett said. "Dark hair, might have been injured, possibly using the name Norton." Ruth Dawson studied him the way she might study a student who had given the wrong answer and was about to find out why. "A lot of people are looking for that same woman," she said. "Two men in particular. One of them wore a vest, just like the one you are standing there without. What makes you different from them? I found something that belongs to her. I am trying to return it." Emmett pulled the diary from his coat. Ruth's eyes dropped to it. She recognized it, he could tell, but she did not reach for it and she did not soften. "Come inside," she said. "But you better talk fast and you better talk true." In Ruth's kitchen, over coffee that was strong enough to dissolve iron, Emmett laid out the whole story. Found the diary on the train. Read it to find the owner. Tracked her to Silver Reef, then here. Wanted to return it and make sure she was safe. That was all. Ruth listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked one question that cut through everything else like a blade through butter. "Does she know you are looking for her?" Emmett hesitated. "No, ma'am." Ruth leaned back in her chair. "Then you are no different from those men in the black vest. You are both tracking a woman across the countryside without her knowledge or her permission. The only difference is you think your reasons are noble. I expect they think the same about theirs." The words hit Emmett like a bucket of cold water. He opened his mouth to argue and then closed it again. Because she was right. He was a stranger following a woman who had not asked to be followed. His intentions were good. He believed that. But Maggie did not know that. From her perspective, he was just another man making decisions about her life without consulting her. "What would you have me do?" he said. Ruth considered him for a long moment. Then she said, "I will write her a letter. I will tell her who you are, what you carry, and why. She will decide for herself whether she wants to meet you. You wait here until I hear back. You do not follow her. You do not ask around town for her. You sit still and you let that woman choose for herself what happens next." Agreed. It went against every instinct Emmett had. He was a man of action, trained by the army to move and solve and fix. Sitting still while someone else decided his next step felt like swallowing sand. "Agreed," he said. Ruth nodded. She pulled paper and pen from a drawer and began writing. Emmett watched her for a moment, then stood and walked to the window. The afternoon light was fading. He would be here at least 2 or 3 days waiting for the letter to reach Maggie and a response to come back. While Ruth wrote, Emmett sat in the small parlor with the diary and read deeper. He had been careful, reading only what seemed necessary to find Maggie. But now, with time to fill and nothing else to do, he turned to earlier pages. He reached the section about Maggie's mother, Eleanor. Maggie described sitting by her mother's bedside during the last weeks of her illness, reading poetry aloud while Eleanor grew weaker each day. She wrote about her mother's hands, once strong enough to split kindling and break horses, becoming thin and pale against the white sheets. She wrote about the last poem she read, something by Tennyson, and how she had been unable to finish it because her voice broke on the final stanza, and her mother had reached over and held her hand and whispered, "It is all right, sweetheart. You do not need to read the ending. I already know how it goes. Emmett's vision blurred. He blinked hard and turned the page. Between two pages that had stuck together with age, something crinkled. A folded slip of paper in a different hand. Older, more careful. Eleanor Calloway's writing. Emmett unfolded it gently, his heart pounding. Keep this land, my daughter. Do not sell it. Do not let anyone take it, no matter what they say. This ground is worth more than your father knows, and one day it will give you freedom. Trust your mother on this. The land is yours, and so is the future it holds. Emmett read it 3 times. The implications settled over him like a cold fog. Eleanor had known the land was valuable. She had kept that knowledge from Frederick. She had hidden this letter inside her diary, inside the book she knew would pass to her daughter, the one person she trusted completely. And now Harlan Winters wanted that land badly enough to arrange a marriage for it. The courtship was never about Maggie. It was about dirt and whatever lay beneath it. Emmett carefully replaced the letter between the pages. He sat in Ruth's parlor as the shadows lengthened, holding secrets that did not belong to him, carrying knowledge about a woman's inheritance that she herself might not possess. Then he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out another piece of paper. The letter from his father, 3 months old, the envelope soft from handling, the seal still unbroken. He had carried it from Tennessee to Texas to Kansas City to Missouri, without once having the courage to open it. He had told himself he was not ready, that there was never a good time, that some words, once read, could not be unread. But sitting here in a stranger's parlor, holding Eleanor Calloway's hidden letter to her daughter, Emmett understood something for the first time. Eleanor had written those words because she might not have another chance. She had hidden them where only Maggie would find them, because the future is not guaranteed, and the things we need to say cannot always wait. His hands trembled as he broke the seal. His father's handwriting was shaky but determined, the letters formed with effort by a hand that was losing its steadiness. Dear Emmett, I have been ill. The doctors say it is my lungs, and they are not hopeful about the outcome. I do not write this to make you feel guilty or to beg you to come home. I write it because there are things I should have said years ago and I may not get another chance. I was wrong to try to make you stay. Your mother always said you had too much sky in you for this farm. I should have listened to her. She knew you better than I did, or maybe she just loved you better. Either way, she was right and I was a stubborn old fool. I forgive you for leaving, son. I hope you can forgive me for making it so hard. And for the bottle. Lord help me. For the bottle. I have lived with that night every day since, and I expect I will carry it to my grave. Be well. Be happy. Be whatever you need to be. That is all a father should ever want for his son. Your father, Samuel Crawford. Emmett sat perfectly still. The letter shook in his hands. He read it again, and a third time. Then he folded it carefully and pressed it against his chest and wept. He wept for his father, sick and dying in Tennessee, writing words of forgiveness with trembling hands. He wept for Maggie's mother, hiding a letter in a diary, because she would not live to deliver its message in person. He wept for Maggie, running through the dark with a wounded shoulder and a broken heart, carrying secrets she did not even know she carried. He wept for himself, for the scar on his arm and the 3 years of silence and the cowardice of an unopened envelope. Ruth came through the parlor on her way to the kitchen. She stopped, looked at him. Then she sat down in the chair across from him and said nothing. She just sat. 2 people in a quiet room while one of them put himself back together. When Emmett finally wiped his face and looked up, Ruth said, "The letter I write to that girl is going to be honest. If you are the kind of man I think you might be, she will want to meet you. If you are not, she will disappear, and you will never find her. Either way she chooses." Emmett nodded. Either way she chooses. 2 days later, a telegram arrived from Ruth's friend in Marionville. Miss Norton arrived safe, but a man in a black vest came asking for her just hours later. She is still here but frightened. Pike was faster. Pike had the train. And Emmett had given his word to Ruth that he would wait. He paced the parlor like a caged animal. Every instinct screamed at him to ride, to move, to do something. Ruth watched him from the doorway and said, "You promised. She chooses. Let her choose." Emmett gripped the back of a chair until his knuckles went white. Then he sat down and waited. Mrs. Henderson locked the back door behind Maggie and said, "Child, there is a man standing outside the general store staring straight at my house." Ida Henderson was 71 years old, 4 feet 11 inches, a former battlefield nurse from the war between the states, and she had the temperament of a woman who had held men's hands while they died and was not about to be intimidated by anyone this side of the grave. She had taken one look at Maggie's letter from Ruth, one look at Maggie's bandaged shoulder, and said, "You are staying here until I say otherwise." And that is the end of that discussion. Her boarding house was a large converted home on the main street of Marionville, with 6 rooms for let and a kitchen that always smelled of something good. Her son Will ran the livery down the street, a solid young man of 25 who asked no questions and did whatever his mother told him. For 2 days, Maggie had felt almost safe. She had eaten real meals, slept in a real bed, and allowed her shoulder wound to begin healing properly. Mrs. Henderson changed the bandages twice a day, clucking disapprovingly at the original field dressing while grudgingly admitting that whoever had done it knew their way around carbolic acid. But Pike had found Marionville. He did not storm the boarding house. He did not make threats. He was smarter than that. Instead, he sent a letter through the post office, addressed to Miss Norton. The handwriting was precise and elegant. Miss Calloway. Let us dispense with the pretense of false names. Mr. Winters requests the pleasure of your company to discuss terms agreeable to both parties. He will arrive in Springfield on the 1st day of July to formalize proceedings before Judge Tanner. You have 2 weeks to return voluntarily. Continued flight will only necessitate measures that neither of us would prefer. I trust you will see reason. Silas Pike, on behalf of Harlan Winters. 2 weeks. The words burned in Maggie's mind. And the word proceedings. There was something legal behind that word, something iron and final that she did not fully understand yet but could feel closing around her like a trap. Mrs. Henderson read the letter over Maggie's shoulder and made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a growl. "That man can formalize his proceedings with the back end of my boot," she said. But she was not smiling. She had seen enough of the world to know that men with money and lawyers were more dangerous than men with guns. That same afternoon, another letter arrived, not from Pike, from Ruth Dawson in Aurora. Maggie opened it with trembling fingers. Ruth wrote in her direct, unadorned style, wasting no words. "A man came to my door 2 days after you left. His name is Emmett Crawford. He is a cowboy, former Army scout, and he found your diary on the train. He has been carrying it ever since, trying to return it to you. He read it. I told him that was wrong, and he agreed with me. He is not connected to Winters or your father. I would stake my reputation on that. He asked me to write this letter because I told him you should be the one to decide whether to meet him. He is waiting in Aurora for your answer. If you want him gone, say the word, and I will send him away. I will tell you one thing, Margaret. He asked me if you were safe before he asked where you were. In my experience, that tells you what you need to know about a person's character." Maggie read that last line twice. "He asked if you were safe before he asked where you were." She sat with those words for a long time, turning them over in her mind the way Thomas used to turn his rocks, examining them from every angle. Her father had never asked if she was safe. He asked where she was. Winters had never asked if she was safe. He asked how to find her. Every man in her life had treated her location as more important than her well-being. But this stranger, this cowboy who had read her diary, had put it the other way around. That was not love. Maggie was not foolish enough to think so. It was not even trust. But it was something. A crack in the wall she had built around herself. A small, curious opening through which she allowed herself to wonder about a man named Emmett Crawford. Mrs. Henderson saw her face and said, "What does it say?" Maggie told her. About the diary, the cowboy, the question he asked Ruth first. Mrs. Henderson listened and then said in her practical way, "When the wolves are circling, sometimes the fox needs a friend. That does not mean every stranger with a kind face is one, but it does mean you cannot outrun this alone forever." Maggie had two choices. Keep running toward Springfield alone with Pike on her heels and a 2-week deadline hanging over her head. Or write back to Ruth, agree to meet this Emmett Crawford, accept the risk of trusting someone new, and maybe, just maybe, gain an ally. She chose the second option, but with conditions that she wrote out clearly in her reply. Public meeting only, at the church in Billings, which was the next major stop between Marionville and Springfield. She would carry her derringer. If anything felt wrong, she would vanish permanently. Before leaving Marionville, Maggie did one more thing. She wrote a letter to Aunt Clara, telling her she was heading to Springfield by way of Billings and could be reached care of the Billings church in the meantime. She mentioned the guardianship threat from Pike's letter without knowing its full shape. She asked Clara to let Thomas know she was all right. That letter, those few sentences, would prove to be one of the most important things she ever wrote. But she did not know that yet. Escape from Marionville happened at dawn. Will Henderson helped by creating a diversion so simple it was almost beautiful. He went to the livery where Pike's horse was stabled and accidentally left the stall gate unlatched. The horse wandered out into the street at first light, and Will spent a good noisy hour chasing it around town, drawing every pair of eyes, including Pike's, while Maggie slipped out the back of the boarding house on a borrowed mare. She rode through morning fog down red dirt roads between fields of tall Missouri grass. The air was cool and wet, heavy with the smell of earth and wildflowers. Meadowlarks sang from fence posts. The sky turned pink and then gold as the sun crested the hills. It was beautiful. She let herself notice that. Even in the middle of running, even with fear like a stone in her stomach, she let herself see the beauty of the world she was moving through. Her mother would have wanted that. She reached Billings by late afternoon. The church was a small white clapboard building on the edge of town with a modest steeple and a cemetery spreading out behind it like a garden of stones. The minister was an elderly man named Reverend Hollis, who asked no questions when Maggie presented herself and said she was waiting for someone. He showed her to a small room at the back of the church. On the table she found a letter, not the diary, just a letter, written in blocky, careful handwriting. The handwriting of a man who thought before he wrote. "I am drawing Pike south away from you. Wait for me here. If I do not come in 2 days, go to Springfield alone. Your diary is safe with me. Emmett Crawford." Maggie stared at the letter. He had already been here. He had left the diary safe somewhere on his person and ridden south to deliberately draw Pike in the wrong direction. He was using himself as bait. For her, a woman he had never met. She went to the window. The sky to the west was darkening, not sunset. Storm clouds, big ones, building like mountains of ink and iron, the kind of clouds that meant business. She had 2 days. She could leave now, ride for Springfield, avoid the risk. Or she could stay and wait for a man she had never seen to walk out of a storm because he said he would. Maggie looked at the letter again. Then at the sky. She sat down and waited. Emmett woke to the smell of smoke, the taste of blood in his mouth, and rain hammering his face so hard he could not tell if his eyes were open or shut. For a moment he did not know where he was. The world was dark and loud and wet, and his ribs screamed when he tried to sit up. Then memory came back in jagged pieces. The creek bottom. The 2 men stepping out from behind the rocks. The first one swinging something heavy. Then nothing. Road agents. The same breed of opportunists who haunted every stretch of lonely trail in Missouri. Maybe the same ones Maggie had encountered. Emmett would never know for sure. What he knew was that they had taken his horse, his money, his rifle, and his saddlebag. They had not found the diary because it was wrapped in oilcloth inside his right boot. A habit from his army days when keeping documents dry was the difference between delivered orders and dead men. He sat up slowly. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the creek into a roaring brown torrent. Lightning split the sky, and he could see the terrain around him in frozen white flashes. Hills, trees bent sideways in the wind. The road, somewhere above and to the west. Billings was north, maybe 8 miles, maybe 10. In the dark, in a storm, on foot, with cracked ribs and a cut above his eye that would not stop bleeding. He had told Maggie he would come. He had put it in writing. If I do not come in 2 days, he had 1 day left. Emmett got up and started walking. The storm was merciless. The wind drove rain into his face like needles. The mud sucked at his boots with every step. Lightning came so close at one point that he could smell the ozone and feel the hair on his arm stand up. He stumbled on a root and went down hard on his injured ribs and lay in the mud for a full minute, gasping, wondering if this was where the story ended. Then he thought about the diary inside his boot, about the woman who had written in it, about Eleanor's hidden letter, about Maggie, sitting in a church somewhere ahead of him, deciding whether to trust a man she had never met. He got up. He kept walking. In Billings, in the small room at the back of the church, Maggie sat by the window and watched the storm tear the sky apart. The minister's wife had come by at sundown to bring food and urge her to leave. "This weather is only getting worse, dear. If your friend was coming, he would have been here by now." Maggie had looked at Emmett's letter on the table. "If I do not come in 2 days." It had been 1 day. She had 1 more. "I will wait," she said. The minister's wife looked at her the way people look at someone they think is making a mistake, but are too polite to say so. Then she left, and Maggie sat alone with the sound of rain on the roof and the smell of wet wood and candle wax. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair with her derringer in her lap and the letter on the table, and she waited because something inside her, something she could not name or explain, told her he would come. Near midnight, someone pounded on the church door. Maggie's heart lurched. She grabbed the derringer, crossed through the dark church to the front entrance, and pulled the door open against the wind. A man stood there, soaked through to the bone, mud caked up to his thighs, blood running from a cut above his eye and mixing with the rain on his face. He was swaying on his feet, one arm pressed against his ribs. In his other hand, pulled from inside his boot, dripping wet but intact, was a small leather-bound book with a carved letter M on the cover. He held it out to her. "This belongs to you." Maggie stared at him, at the diary, at the blood on his face and the way he could barely stand, at the fact that this man had walked through a storm on foot with broken ribs to deliver a book to a woman he had never met. She took the diary with her left hand and punched his shoulder with her right. "You read my diary and followed me across 5 towns, she said. It was not a question. They got inside. Maggie bolted the door against the wind. Emmett collapsed into a pew, his breath coming in short, painful gasps. Maggie lit a candle and got her first real look at him in the flickering light. He was older than she had expected, weathered, a scar on his left arm that she could see through his torn sleeve, hazel eyes that looked exhausted and honest, and something else she could not quite name. She set the candle on the floor and went to work on his injuries. She had learned enough from Mrs. Henderson to clean the cut above his eye, and from Ruth to recognize cracked ribs when she felt them through a shirt. She worked in silence, efficient and cold, because she was furious and she was grateful, and she did not know which emotion to let drive. Emmett sat still and let her work. He did not try to charm her or explain himself or fill the silence with words. He just breathed and bled and waited. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and said, "Talk." Emmett talked. He told her everything, finding the diary, reading it, tracking her to Silver Reef, meeting Clara. The man in the black vest at the saloon who turned out to be Pike, the race to catch up, Ruth Dawson's challenge, the letter, the agreement to let Maggie choose, the ride south to draw Pike away, the road agents, He left nothing out, including the parts that made him look bad. "I gave Pike information at that saloon," he said. "I was careless. I may have made things harder for you, and I'm sorry for that." Maggie listened with the same intensity she gave to everything. When he finished, she said, "You read my most private thoughts. Every fear, every doubt, every moment of weakness I ever committed to paper. You know things about me that I have never told another living soul. And you think bringing back the book makes that all right?" "No," Emmett said. "I think it makes it less wrong. But I know it does not make it all right. I had no business reading past the first page. I told myself I was looking for a name, but the truth is I was drawn in. Your words, your honesty, the courage it took to write what you wrote. I could not stop." Maggie was quiet. Then she said, "Why did you really come?" Emmett looked at her. In the candlelight, her face was sharp and tired and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with prettiness. It was the face of a woman who had fought for her life and was still fighting. He thought about lying, about offering some simple explanation, but she deserved the truth. "I did not come looking for you because of the diary," he said. "I came because the woman who wrote it deserved to be found." Maggie's hand tightened on the doorframe until her knuckles went white. She did not speak. She walked out of the room and closed the door behind her. They slept in separate rooms. The walls were thin. Emmett could not sleep for the pain in his ribs and the hammering of the storm. He sat by the stove in the main room, feeding it wood, staring at the flames. The firelight threw dancing shadows across the walls. And then, because he thought he was alone, because the storm was loud enough to cover his voice, because the words had been building in him for days and he could not hold them back, he began to talk. "Page 23, he said to the fire. "You wrote that you wanted just once to sit still without anyone needing something from you, just exist without being useful to anybody." He paused, fed another stick into the stove. "You can sit still as long as you want. I do not need anything from you." In the next room, Maggie lay on her side, facing the wall. Her eyes were wide open. She heard every word. She did not turn around, but she pulled the diary against her chest and held it there, and something inside her cracked open just a little. In the morning, the storm had blown itself out, and the world was washed clean and dripping. Maggie came out of her room to find Emmett already up, standing at the church window. He turned when he heard her. "Two riders coming from the south," he said. "The one on the left is wearing a black vest." Pike had caught up. They had one horse, one derringer, and roughly 20 minutes before Pike got close enough to see their faces. Emmett moved fast, despite his ribs. He and Maggie went out the back of the church, where her borrowed mare was tied under a lean-to shelter. The horse was skittish from the storm, but steady enough to carry two riders. Emmett helped Maggie mount first, then swung up behind her, biting back a groan as his ribs protested. "Hold on to the mane," he said. "We are going to ride hard." He guided the mare northeast, along a ridgeline trail that cut through thick oak forest. The ground was muddy from the storm, treacherous in spots where the rain had carved new channels across the path. But the mud worked in their favor, too, because it slowed Pike's horses just as much. Emmett knew this country. Not from having traveled it before, but from maps. Army survey maps he had studied years ago when his unit was posted in southwestern Missouri during the last months of the war. The Ridgeline Trail was not on any civilian map. It had been cut by Union cavalry and largely forgotten since. But Emmett remembered. They rode hard for an hour, for an hay-ten. Maggie did not speak, and neither did Emmett. There was no breath to spare for words. The trail dropped them down off the ridge into a valley where the railroad tracks gleamed wet in the morning sun. A station. Barely a station, really, just a platform and a water tower, and a weathered sign that read Billings Junction. And, miracle of miracles, a train was sitting there taking on water, steam hissing from its boiler like a living thing. Emmett dropped from the horse, grabbed Maggie's hand, and they ran for the train. The conductor was already signaling departure. Emmett shoved a crumpled bill into the man's hand, and they tumbled aboard as the train began to move. They sat in the back of a half-empty car, breathing hard, looking at each other for the first time in daylight without crisis pressing them forward. Maggie's hair had come loose from its pins and hung in dark tangles around her face. Emmett's eye was swollen half shut, and his shirt was stained with mud and dried blood. "You look terrible," Maggie said. "You should see the other fellow," Emmett said, then added, "Actually, there were two of them, and they took my horse." Maggie stared at him. Then she laughed. Just a small sound, barely more than a breath. But it was the first laugh between them, and Emmett felt it land in his chest like a warm stone. The train carried them northeast toward Springfield. They had hours ahead of them and no immediate threat, and for the first time since they had met, there was space for something other than survival. Maggie held the diary in her lap. She had not let go of it since the church. She opened it now and flipped through the pages slowly, checking that everything was there. When she reached the pages where Eleanor's hidden letter lay pressed between them, she paused. She had not found it before. She might not find it now if the pages stayed stuck. But Emmett had found it. "There is something between those two pages," he said quietly. "Your mother hid a letter there. I found it when I was reading. I should not have, but I did, and you need to know what it says." Maggie carefully separated the stuck pages and unfolded Eleanor's note. She read it again. Her face went through a series of changes that Emmett watched without speaking. Confusion, understanding, grief, anger. "She knew," Maggie whispered. "Mama knew the land was valuable. She knew, and she hid it from Father, and she left it to me because she knew. She knew something like this might happen." Emmett nodded. "That is what Winters is after. The marriage, the engagement, all of it. It was never about you. It was about dirt and whatever is under it." Maggie's jaw tightened. She carefully replaced the letter and closed the diary. Her hands were steady now. The shaking was gone. In its place was something harder, something that looked like the beginning of a plan. They were quiet for a while. The train rocked and swayed. Missouri slid past the windows, green and golden in the afternoon light. At a water stop in the middle of nowhere, they stepped off the train to stretch their legs and breathe. The platform was empty. The sky was enormous overhead, scrubbed clean by the storm, packed with more stars than either of them had seen in weeks. Maggie began to shake, not from cold. The adrenaline of the past 2 days was finally draining out of her, and the fear was rushing in to fill the space. She wrapped her arms around herself and trembled, her teeth chattering even though the night air was warm. Emmett took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. Then he stepped back. 2 deliberate paces, giving her room. Maggie looked at him. Standing there coatless in the cool night air, 2 careful steps away, not moving closer because she had not invited him to. And she thought of page 23, of a man who would let her sit still without needing anything from her. A man who gave space instead of taking it. "You can come closer," she said. Emmett took 1 step. Just 1. Maggie almost smiled. "I said closer. Not 1 step. I wanted to be sure." And she laughed. Really laughed this time, the sound spilling out of her like water breaking free of a dam. And Emmett stood there with his bruised ribs and his swollen eye and thought that he had been imagining this sound for a week, ever since he first read her words. But the real thing was better than anything his imagination could have built. He took the 2nd step. Back on the train, as the miles unrolled beneath them, Maggie asked about the scar on his arm. She had seen it through his torn sleeve at the church, and she had been wondering. Emmett was quiet for a long time. The train rocked. Outside, the night rushed past. "The last night I spent at home in Tennessee," he said finally. "I told my father I was leaving. He was drunk. He had been drunk most nights since my mother died the year before. He did not take it well. He paused. He threw a whiskey bottle. It hit the door frame and shattered. A piece of glass caught my arm. He dropped to his knees as soon as he saw the blood, started crying. saying he was sorry. I left that night with a rag tied around my arm, and I did not look back for 3 years. Maggie listened without interrupting. He was not a violent man, Emmett said. It was the worst moment of his life. I think it haunted him more than it ever haunted me. Did you forgive him? Emmett stared at his hands. I opened his letter 2 days ago. For the first time in 3 months. He is dying. Lung ailment. And in his letter, he did not ask me to forgive him. He forgave me for leaving. He said my mother always told him I had too much sky in me for that farm. He stopped talking. Maggie was quiet beside him. Then she said, "We are the same, you and I. Both running, both carrying our fathers in our pockets." Emmett turned to look at her. In the dim lamplight of the train car, her face was tired and open and more beautiful than anything he had seen in his 31 years, not because of her features, though those were fine enough, because of the honesty in her expression, the willingness to see him without flinching. For the first time, Maggie opened the diary voluntarily. She turned to the entry about her mother's last days and read it aloud. Her voice was soft but steady, filling the space between them with Eleanor's story. The poetry by the bedside, the weakening hands, the final words. You do not need to read the ending. I already know how it goes. When she finished, neither of them spoke for a long while. The train carried them forward through the dark. Their shoulders were almost touching. Almost. "Thank you for keeping this safe," Maggie said quietly. She meant the diary. She meant more than the diary. When the train pulled into Springfield at dawn, Emmett spotted it before Maggie did. A poster nailed to the station wall. He stepped in front of her, blocking her view, but she pushed past him and saw it herself. Missing. Margaret Calloway. Young woman of unsound mind. Family seeks her safe return. $200 reward. Below the words was a sketch of her face, good enough for anyone to recognize. Winters had turned her into a missing person. He had declared her insane. And now any person in Springfield could identify her and turn her in for the bounty. Maggie stared at the poster. Her face went white and then very, very still. "He called me insane," she said. Her voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a woman who is holding herself together by sheer force of will. "He told the world I'm out of my mind, that I need to be collected and returned like a stray dog." Emmett reached for the poster and tore it down. "We need a lawyer," he said, "and I know one." Jack Callahan laid the wanted poster flat on his desk and said, "Good news is this guardianship order is full of holes. Bad news is Winters just arrived in Springfield and he did not come alone." Jack was a former Army man turned lawyer who worked out of a cramped office above a hardware store on Commercial Street. He was 50 years old, lean as jerky, with eyes that missed nothing and a flask of bourbon that was never far from his hand. He owed Emmett a debt from the war, and he was the kind of man who paid his debts. Emmett had brought Maggie to Jack's office at first light, both of them exhausted and filthy and running out of time. July 1st was 3 days away. Winters had already arrived in Springfield, according to Jack's sources, and had an appointment with Judge Tanner to formalize the guardianship proceedings. Jack examined the paperwork Pike had been carrying. The guardianship order bore Frederick Calloway's signature and declared Margaret Calloway mentally unfit to manage her own affairs. On its face, it looked legitimate. But Jack had spent 20 years reading legal documents, and he saw what others might miss. "The signature is wrong," he said. "The ink is a different shade than the rest of the document. Darker, applied with more pressure. See these lines here?" He pointed. "That is not a natural hand. That is someone tracing, following a model signature very carefully. Your father did not sign this." Maggie leaned forward. "Are you sure?" "I would stake my license on it," Jack said. "Whoever forged this was good, but not perfect. The question is, can we prove it before a judge? And for that we need your father to testify that he did not sign." "My father is in Carthage," Maggie said. "That is 200 miles away." "Then we need to get him here in 3 days," Jack said. Emmett thought of the letter Maggie had written to Aunt Clara from Marionville. Clara knew about the guardianship threat. If Clara had contacted Thomas, and if Thomas had confronted Frederick about the forged signature, then there was a chance. A slim one, but a chance. He asked Maggie, "Did you write to Clara about the proceedings? I mentioned them in my letter." "I did not know the details, but I told her Winters was using legal pressure. That might be enough." What Emmett did not know, what none of them knew, was that the chain of communication was already in motion. Clara had received Maggie's letter 4 days ago. She had immediately telegraphed Thomas in Carthage. Thomas had gone to his father with the telegram in his hand, and a fury in his voice that Frederick had never heard from his quiet younger child. "Did you sign a paper saying Maggie is insane?" Thomas demanded. Frederick had stared at his son. "What paper? What are you talking about? A guardianship order. Winters is using it to have Maggie forcibly returned. He told a judge she is mentally unfit." Frederick Calloway's face had gone from confused to white to a shade of red that Thomas had only seen once before, the day Eleanor died. "I signed no such thing," Frederick said. His voice shook with something that was not weakness. It was rage. "That son of a—" He stopped himself. He drew a breath. "I signed no paper. If such a thing exists, then Winters forged my name, and he will answer for it before God and the law." Frederick and Thomas had boarded a train for Springfield the next morning. Now, in Jack Callahan's office 3 days before the hearing, a knock came at the door. Jack opened it to find 2 men. One was a gangly young man of 20 with dark hair and his sister's eyes. The other was an older man, thinner and grayer than he should have been, with the frail look of someone who had been ill, but the fierce expression of someone who was not done fighting. Thomas Calloway and Frederick Calloway had arrived. The reunion between Maggie and her family was not the tearful embrace of a story. It was awkward and painful and real. Frederick looked at his daughter and Maggie looked at her father, and neither knew what to say first. 3 months of silence and hurt stood between them like a wall. Thomas broke it. He crossed the room and hugged his sister so hard she gasped. "I have missed you," he said. "The house is not the same without you." Maggie hugged him back, blinking hard. "I missed you too." Frederick stood apart, watching. Then he said, "We need to deal with Winters first. The rest can wait." It was not warm, it was not forgiveness, but it was a man putting his daughter's safety above his own pride. And for Frederick Calloway, that was a beginning. The confrontation came the following morning at Judge Tanner's chambers. Winters arrived with Pike and a second hired man and a local deputy carrying the guardianship order. He was confident. He had the law on his side. He had documents and witnesses, and the smooth assurance of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. He did not expect to see Frederick Calloway standing in the chamber. Emmett blocked the doorway when Winters tried to approach Maggie, not with a weapon, with words and his body. "Miss Calloway is represented by counsel," he said. "Her attorney is present, and so is her father." Winters' eyes found Frederick across the room. For one moment, just a breath, the polished confidence cracked. Then it sealed back over. But the damage was done. Everyone in the room had seen it. Jack Callahan presented the evidence methodically, the ink analysis, the pressure inconsistencies, the traced signature. He asked the judge to compare the signature on the guardianship order with samples of Frederick's actual handwriting from business documents he had brought from Carthage. Then Frederick took the stand. He was not a sympathetic figure. He was a stubborn man who had tried to force his daughter into an unwanted marriage. He had closed himself off after his wife's death and buried his grief in work and whiskey. He had failed Maggie in 100 ways, but he had not signed that paper. "I wanted my daughter to marry this man," Frederick said, looking directly at the judge. "That much is true, and I will not deny it. I believed it was a practical match. I believed I knew what was best." He paused. "But I never agreed to call her unfit. Margaret has more sense in her little finger than most men I have met in my life, including, God help me, myself. Winters attempted to argue that Frederick was confused, that age and illness had affected his memory. Frederick's response silenced the room. "I am old, sir, but I know the difference between my own hand and a forgery, and I know the difference between a businessman and a swindler." Jack delivered the final blow. He presented evidence that Winters had hired a geological surveyor to assess the Callaway land 6 months before proposing to Maggie. The survey found significant deposits of lead and zinc, valuable minerals in Missouri's mining economy. Winters had known the land's worth before he ever looked at Maggie. The marriage was never about her. It was always about what she owned. Judge Tanner voided the guardianship order. He entered a finding of probable cause for forgery of legal documents and referred the case to the county prosecutor for criminal proceedings. Jack told Emmett afterward that Winters would likely face charges in the Greene County Court, and if convicted, would serve time in the state penitentiary in Jefferson City. There was one moment near the end when Pike's hand drifted toward his holster. Emmett saw it. He had lost his gun to the road agents, but he carried a knife on his belt, and he had it out and ready before Pike's fingers closed on the grip. Judge Tanner slammed his gavel and shouted for order. The deputies stepped between them. The moment passed. But Emmett's eyes did not leave Pike's face, and something in that look made Pike understand that this particular cowboy had seen worse than a hired man's bravado. Winters and Pike left Springfield that afternoon. Both men knew that Winters' reputation in Carthage was finished. The case, the evidence, the whispers that would follow, no amount of money could buy back what had been lost in that courtroom. After the hearing, Frederick asked to speak with Maggie alone. They stood in the courthouse hallway, neither quite meeting the other's eyes. Frederick's hands trembled at his sides. "I was wrong about Winters," he said. "I should have seen what he was. I should have listened to you." He paused. "But I still think you need someone to take care of you, Margaret." Maggie's voice was steady. "I have a teaching position starting in September. I have a roof over my head. I have people who care about me. That is stability, Father. I built it myself." Frederick looked at her for a long moment. Then he glanced through the doorway at Emmett, who was talking with Jack. He looked back at Maggie. He did not smile. He did not embrace her. But he nodded. A single, small, deliberate nod. Not full acceptance. Not yet. Just the first step of a man learning to see his daughter as a person instead of a problem. That evening, alone in her room at Mrs. Thatcher's boarding house, Maggie opened her diary and wrote the first entry since losing it. "Today I am free. And there is a man named Emmett Crawford who said I deserve to be found. I think he was right." She paused, looked at the words. Then she added one more line. "I think I am beginning to love him." She read it back, considered it carefully. Then she crossed out the word beginning. 3 weeks after Winters left Springfield, Maggie stood before 23 children on her first day of teaching and realized this was the stage the actress had told her about all those years ago. The classroom was new. The walls still smelled of fresh-cut pine, and the chalkboard had never been written on, and the desks were arranged in neat rows that would not stay neat for long. 23 faces looked up at her, some curious, some bored. One or two openly skeptical about this young woman standing where a teacher should be. Maggie took a breath. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Miss Calloway, and I'm going to be your teacher this year. Before we start with reading and arithmetic and all the things you expect, I want to tell you a story." She told them about a fox, a small fox who lived in a town where the other animals kept telling her she should be a rabbit instead, because rabbits were quieter and more useful and did what they were told. The fox tried to be a rabbit for a while, but she was not very good at it, so she decided to leave and find a place where a fox could be a fox. She ran through 5 towns, Maggie said, and in each town she learned something new. She learned that the world was bigger than anyone had told her. She learned that she was braver than she thought, and she learned that sometimes the right home is not the one you were born in, but the one you build for yourself. The room was silent. Every child was listening, even the skeptical ones. "Now," Maggie said, reaching for the chalk, "who wants to learn how to read the story for themselves?" On the other side of Springfield, Emmett was working at the stable, brushing down a difficult mare that had thrown two other handlers. The horse was skittish and mean-tempered, and everyone else had given up on her. But Emmett was patient. He talked to the horse in a low, steady voice. He moved slowly. He did not force anything. By the end of the hour, the mare was eating from his hand. After work, he sat at the small desk in the house they had rented near the school and wrote a letter. Dear Father, I'm sorry it took me 3 months to open your letter. I'm sorry it took me so many years to understand that leaving did not have to mean abandoning. I am not coming home, but I am not running anymore. There is a woman here who taught me that, though she does not know it yet. I love you. I hope there is still time for that to matter. Your son, Emmett. He sealed the letter and set it aside for posting. Then he sat for a while, looking at the wall, feeling the weight of the words he had finally written. He had been carrying that silence like a stone for 3 years. Setting it down felt like being able to breathe fully for the first time. A letter had arrived that morning from Jack Callahan. Winters pleaded guilty to the forgery charge to avoid a public trial. Lost his freight company. Lost his standing in Carthage. Pike quit his employ and headed west looking for new work. The county prosecutor is satisfied. The case is closed. The land is Maggie's, free and clear. It is valuable, Emmett. Make sure she keeps it. Emmett had smiled when he read it, folded the letter, put it in his pocket. Other letters had come too in recent weeks, each one closing a circle that had been left open. Frederick had returned to Carthage and begun his own slow process of change. He sent Maggie a package containing a set of school books that had belonged to Eleanor. No long letter came with them, just a card with a single line in his careful hand. Your mother would be proud. He was still stubborn, still learning, but trying. Ruth Dawson wrote from Aurora with news that made Maggie cry. Ruth had been elected to the Aurora School Board, the first woman to hold such a position in the county. Give those children hell, Ruth, Maggie whispered as she read it. Thomas sent a letter with a small polished stone wrapped in cloth. The note read, I kept this in the root cellar, in the spot where I used to hide you. You do not need hiding anymore, but keep the rock so you remember there was always someone on your side. Maggie put the stone on her desk at school where she could see it every day. On an ordinary afternoon in late September, Maggie sat on the front steps of the boarding house grading papers. Her hair was escaping its pins as it always did by afternoon. Ink stained her fingers. The late summer sun was warm on her face. Emmett came up the walk, dusty from the stable, and sat down beside her. They were quiet for a while. Comfortable quiet. The kind that only people who trust each other can share. Then Emmett said, I am no good at talking about feelings. You know that. You have read my handwriting. You know I think too long before every word. Maggie looked at him sideways, but did not speak. So I will just say it plain, he said. I loved you before I met you from the pages of that diary, but now that I know you, the real you, not the one I imagined, but the one sitting right here with ink on her fingers and chalk dust on her nose, you are more stubborn than I expected, and funnier than I had any right to hope, and a considerable sight more terrifying than the diary suggested. And I love you more. Not the woman in the book. You. This version. The real one. Maggie set down her pen. She opened the diary to the last written page and held it out so he could read. The entry from the night after the hearing. I think I am beginning to love him. With beginning crossed out. I got rid of that word 3 weeks ago, she said. Their first kiss was on a porch step with papers scattered around them and the smell of horses and chalk dust between them. It was not fireworks. It was not a grand declaration set against a dramatic sky. It was two people who had been running for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to stand still. And standing still together, choosing to stay instead of flee, felt like the bravest thing either of them had ever done. On a Sunday afternoon in October, Maggie and Emmett attended church. Afterward, in the crowd on the steps, A harried woman carrying a squirming toddler bumped hard into Maggie, knocking papers from her hand. "Oh, heavens, I am so sorry," the woman said, flustered, chasing after the toddler with one hand while trying to help pick up papers with the other. Maggie steadied her, helped her gather the papers and the child, and smiled. "No harm done? Happens to everyone." The woman hurried off. Emmett saw a strange expression cross Maggie's face. Recognition, and then wonder, and then a quiet, private laugh. "What?" he said. "Nothing, just... I think I have met her before." She did not explain, but she smiled the entire walk home. The woman on the train. The mother with the baby. Just a mother. Never a threat. Just someone moving through the world in a hurry, bumping into strangers, causing small accidents that sometimes changed everything. Maggie could finally let that last fear go. They did not marry right away. Maggie wanted to teach a full year first. She wanted to know she could stand on her own before she stood beside anyone. Emmett respected that without asking twice. They rented a small house near the school, 3 rooms and a tiny kitchen, not the ranch of their dreams. Not yet, but theirs. One evening in late October, with the Missouri wind turning cold outside and the lamp burning warm on the kitchen table, Maggie sat writing in her diary. She wrote about her students, about the boy in the back row who had finally spoken for the first time that week, about the girl who had started bringing books from home because she could not wait for reading time at school. She wrote about Emmett, about the way he sang when he thought no one was listening, about the small ranch he talked about building someday. Emmett came through the door smelling of horses and cold air. He hung his coat on the hook, washed his hands at the basin, and sat down across from her at the table. He pulled out a new blank notebook he had bought that morning and picked up a pen. Maggie looked up. "What are you writing?" she said. Emmett dipped the pen and looked at her. "If our children find your diary someday, they should know both sides of the story." Maggie smiled. The kind of smile Emmett knew he would never get tired of, not if he saw it every day for the rest of his life. "Then you should start with the part where you found a diary on a train," she said. "That is where the story begins." Emmett nodded. He looked at the blank page. He thought about the train and the diary and the smell of gunpowder on old leather. He thought about a woman he had not yet known, whose words had pulled him across 5 towns and through a storm and into a life he never could have imagined. He thought about courage and kindness, and the strange, unpredictable grace of lost things found. Then Emmett Crawford dipped his pen into the ink, and on the white page he wrote the first line about a diary, the smell of gunpowder on old leather, and a woman he had not yet met but had already begun to love from the very first page. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.